Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll be getting started with introductions in just a moment, so please make yourselves comfortable. Before we begin, a quick note about Q&A for those of you joining us live in the Zoom webinar. You should see a control in your Zoom interface labeled Q&A. Later on, you'll have an opportunity to use this control to submit typed questions to us, which Professor Jeremy Weissman of the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics will read out for our panelists to address. We appreciate your understanding as we ask that you refrain from submitting your questions until invited to do so by our panelists. Once again, we will be getting started after a short delay to allow time for attendees to join the webinar. Thank you for your patience. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. At this time, I would like to turn things over to Professor Mark Rush, Director of International Education, and Stanley D. and Nikki Waxberg, Professor of Politics and Law at WNL, to give the introduction for tonight's guest speaker and topic.
Thanks, Jeremy. Good evening. I am Mark Rush, and on behalf of the Mudd Center and the Center for International Education, it's my pleasure to welcome you all and our guest, Elizabeth Kolbert. Our program this evening will be in the form of a conversation among Ms. Kolbert, myself, and our colleague, Dr. Lisa Greer, Professor of Geology. Tonight's guest, Elizabeth Kolbert, is a visiting fellow at Williams College and has been a staff writer at the New Yorker since 1999, where she has written extensively on environmental issues. Since 2017, she has also served as a member of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Science and Security Board. Ms. Kolbert is the author of 5 books, one of which is the 2014 Pulitzer Prize-winning The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. In this critically acclaimed work, she documents the extraordinary extent to which humans have altered the Earth. This is not just an analysis of global warming or pollution. Instead, her analysis entails an assessment of humanity's behavior as a species and its corresponding impact on other species that share a closed ecosystem. In this regard, The Sixth Extinction is a sobering read that forces humans to think not just in terms of the ethics of individual dignity and rights. Instead, it forces us to reconsider that individualistic ethical framework within the context of our collective impact on the world and possibly our collective demise. The title of tonight's discussion is accordingly, Climate Change and Its Impact on the World Order. It's my pleasure to welcome Elizabeth Kolbert to campus, however virtually, and to turn the program over now to my colleague and friend, Dr. Lisa Greer, who will begin our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Elizabeth, I'd like to start by asking you, your book, The Sixth Extinction, puts our current progress towards a mass extinction event in the context of the whole of geologic time on our planet. But this is the first time in Earth history where organisms, us, have facilitated that change. Can you place the current rate of biological change on the planet that's due primarily to human-induced climate change in the context of geologic time?
Well, before I answer that, I want to say it's really an honor to virtually be here and to virtually be with all of you. And it's always complicated for me as a journalist to speak to folks like you, many you two here on the panel, and many of you out in the audience, who are very well versed in these issues. So to answer your question, I will do the best I can, but as a geologist, I may throw it back to you. How's that? And I think that while I was writing the book, I grappled with this a lot, because obviously one of the questions is, well, how do you know? How do you know we were in an extinction event? To write a book called The Sixth Extinction is a pretty big claim to make. How's that? And it's not. I really have to say it's not my claim. It is the certainly the consensus view of the scientific community that we are at a moment of very high extinction rates, where they are hundreds of times higher than the so-called background extinction rates that prevailed over most of the history of life, whether we're thousands of times. For some groups, we may be getting into the tens of thousands of times higher rates. So these are pretty complicated questions. And the really complicated question, which you as a geologist know better than anyone, is how do you measure apples and oranges, right? So these great mass extinctions of the past, if you say we're in the sixth extinction, the obvious implication is there have been 5 other ones. And those are the so-called big 5, the most famous of which is the asteroid impact that did in the dinosaurs and 75% of all species on Earth. And that was 66 million years ago. So our record of that is, to put it mildly, very, very sketchy. And when you go further back to the end Permian extinction, which was really sometimes called the mother of all mass extinctions, a tremendous extinction event that did in something like 90% of all species on Earth, that's 250 million years ago. So our records are really, really sketchy. And so you have to say, well, how do you take a thin layer of the geological record, which we can't even date very specifically? It might be 10,000 years, might be 100,000 years, might be 200,000 years. And how do you compare that to what's going on now? So, but people have tried to do that. Paleontologists have tried to do that. They tried to say, can we kind of look at the geological record, of the paleontological record, and try to compare that to what's happening now? And some of the best, so that we have an apples to apples comparison. And there's been a lot of work on that. And the sad answer at the end of the day is that it's entirely possible that extinction rates today, if they continue for just another few hundred years, which in a geological timescale is the blink of an eye, we could reach end Cretaceous extinction rates, and we could be doing things even faster than these other mass extinctions, because we just don't have the resolution there. So that's pretty sobering, and or it should be pretty sobering. How's that? So that's how people try to look at it. And one of the ways they try to look at it is to look at how species are moving through the ranks from endangered or not endangered, very common, to endangered, to critically endangered, to extinct. And they seem to be plodding along that, or sinking along that decline very, very fast. And so that's a real alarm bell.
Yes, thank you. Another question I have, which I found a really resonant theme in your book, an important takeaway that my students also got, was this idea that when catastrophe hits, it's not only the weak that perish. When the Earth system shifts to a different climate or environmental state, the rules of the game change. And what was once very well adapted to the environment, like marine creatures, graptolites 440 million years ago, to the Neanderthals that went extinct about 30,000 years ago. These were strong organisms, and they held advantage, but they no longer did when something changed. I think one of the larger impediments to action on climate change now is from privileged societies feeling insulated from the impacts of climate change. And I was wondering if you could discuss for our audience some of the ways that even those of us with privilege are impacted by climate change. I mean, and sort of the timescale of this, because I think that's a major problem.
Well, I completely agree with you that, we seem to have in the US this, and when I say we, I use that term loosely, has that, but, the sense that like, that's someone else's problem, or a future generation's problem, or whatever, we don't need to worry about that right now. Or that has been the attitude. I think that is changing. And one of the reasons I think it is changing is precisely because climate change is really hitting people where they live. The fires this fall in California were not, indifferent to your, income level. They really hit a lot of people very hard. And in Oregon, fires right now, even as we speak, in Colorado, really bad fire season, hurricane season that was extremely dramatic, continues to be extremely dramatic. Even as we speak, the remnants of Zeta, passing through the midsection of the country, and sea level rise hitting a lot of very fancy coastal communities in this country. So, I think that sense of, oh, it can't happen to me is eroding, let's put it that way, to use sort of a bad pun. But, one of the messages that climate scientists have been trying to convey for really, we're talking about, 50 years now, is that when that happens, don't wait until you get the climate that you don't like. Because once you've gotten the climate that you don't like, there's a lot of inertia in the system. You're not getting, the climate of 50 years ago back just because you decided that you don't like this. And even, to be honest, just because you drive carbon emissions way down, even if we were to succeed in driving carbon emissions really even to zero, there's still a lag time. Now we're a long, long, long way from zero. We're 40 billion tons a year from zero, but that was the warning. It was like, don't wait. Because there's no going back. There's only one direction as far as, for all intents and purposes on a human time scale. So this is the dilemma that we're in, or the prevailing problem for the rest of the lives of, everyone in this audience today is, how do we deal with what we've already baked into the system and avoiding, there's a sort of mantra in climate change circles, avoid the unmanageable and manage the unavoidable. And that's the situation that we're in right now. And whether we're going to avoid the unmanageable is, I think it's still up to us. I hope it's still up to us. But so far we're not doing a particularly good job of rising to that challenge.
Thanks, Elizabeth. I wanted to pick up on just some of what you were saying and then follow with a couple of references to your 2017 New Yorker piece, The Fate of the Earth. There you tell the reader that humans we need to see ourselves differently. And this is really just what you're speaking about. Going back 3.8 billion years, you say no other species has had the dominating impact on the Earth that we do, nor has it changed it at the rate that we're changing it right now. And as you just mentioned, so in some ways that impact already exists regardless whether we switch our coal plants to wind turbines or whatnot, or our gas-powered cars to electric ones. And so you make a shift later in that article, you talk about, again, it's not just the question of the impact or the bigger of the human species, it's our impact on others. And this, suggests as well, we harm other species, their demise becomes ours. And so, you say that if we're just thinking about ourselves, we're failing as ethical agents. And I think that's really the tremendous impact of your writing. Force us to rethink our ethics, because we have to think outside the species in an environmental sense, but also I think outside of our framework, our time frame. There's an ethics of stewardship involved here, where generations that don't exist yet, we have a debt to, and we're not paying attention to it. And so, for starters, then reading through your work, whether I read your article or your fantastic book, I'm reminded of a scene, and I'm hoping I'm not dating myself here for the audience, a scene in the movie The Matrix, which some folks love and some folks hate, I understand. But anyway, that's an inside joke, audience. We'll get back to that later. But anyway, there's a great scene in that when Agent Smith has Morpheus in chains, and he tells them what he hates about humans, that we even make the Matrix smell bad. But worse, he says, he compares us to a species, a virus that just goes into an ecosystem and wipes it out and then leaves. And so it's striking. What I come away from your writing is that we need to change the way we think about ourselves, not as individuals, but collectively as like a species or a herd that needs management. That's a tough pill to swallow. I'm just wondering how you would respond to that, because you're really asking humans to rethink our ethical framework.
Yes, I do think at the very center of all of these conversations, and it's a conversation that that we haven't really had, I think, as a society, maybe happening sort of on the fringes, and many issues of social justice are rising to the fore now in the U.S. as well they should be, and this other issue of of how we treat each other, how different groups of people treat other groups of people, is one of the central questions of our moment right now, and people really, I think, grappling with that. I don't want to make too grand a claim for whether we're really grappling with that, but I think lurking in the background and not coming to the fore, and I don't know when or if it will, is how we treat the millions of other species with whom we share planet Earth, and we feel very deep kinship with our pets and the animals that we've domesticated, but we seem to increasingly, and I think one of the problems, and many people have pointed this out, many anthropologists, for example, people who lived in deep connection to their surroundings, who depended on that hunt for survival, had a very deep feeling of connection to other species, whatever you want to call it, spiritual, mystical, whatever it is. And as we, pick up our, chickens from the grocery store, we have lost that. And I also want to say, and I don't want to say that humans were ever particularly, great. We are a different breed of animal. It just turns out, when you look at the history of humanity, as soon as we figured out how to, sort of be a predator without of many different species, we didn't need to evolve a bigger claws or, bigger teeth. We just made new tools. And as soon as we figured out how to do that and started moving around the world into new parts of the globe and encountering new species and doing in new species, we were something new under the sun. I mean, we really are something new under the sun. I think that increasingly we've come to realize this, and it's a very interesting twist on, it's sort of like the anti-Darwin, right? In the 1850s, Darwin showed us that we were just an animal. We'd evolved, from apes. We had a lot of close cousins, and now we have fewer and fewer close cousins because we're doing in our closest relatives. And now we have this other destabilizing thought, I think, which is this destabilizing thought of the 21st century, where actually we are something different. We're capable of doing, incredible damage to this planet, which is the only planet that we have called home. And how are we going to whether it is for our own survival, and I think there are definitely, our connection to the natural world is still very intimate. Everything we eat, is a biological agent. All of our pathogens are biological agents. We're sort of maybe becoming more aware of that in COVID-19 era. But how we relate to these species, either out of selfishness, human survival, or out of a sense that is the legacy of our species to do in everything else. These are the great, really, I think, going to become the pressing and urgent problems and questions of our time. And I think that they are starting to sort of percolate up, largely owing to climate change, but maybe not only to climate change. And I also really need to point out that climate change is just one driver, and right now probably not even the major driver of extinction, but it's going to ratchet up as the earth warms at a very, very rapid rate.
So I think it's fascinating you mentioned Darwin, because in rejecting him, Western liberal thinkers rejected his consigning us essentially to the rest of the herds on the planet. But yet, we insisted that we're ethical agents in response to him, and you mentioned that we're failing as that. And I think that places humanity and frankly philosophers, ethicists, in a very difficult situation. As ethical agents, we tend to think in terms of individual dignity, individual rights, and ethical agents seldom refer to themselves in terms of being a species or a herd. It's very individualistic. And so it seems that, you're asking us on the one hand, collectively as a species, look outward. But as ethical agents, we have to, it seems, for a change, look inward as well and replace our very individualistically based ethical system with a collective one of ethics, collective versions of rights and values. This is a radical reframing of really Western thinking. I'm just wondering, how do we go about pitching that to humanity? Because it shakes us really to the foundations of Western liberal thought.
Well, I am going to turn that question back on you, because I really don't have the answer for that, and I don't know. I can only say that quite obviously and I think another huge issue for us, even before we get to sort of the abstract questions of individual rights and individual dignity and individual ethics is, there a lot of the goods that we have, a lot of the ideals that we have as a society are, I think, increasingly coming into conflict. What is the good life? What do we consider to be, what is the standard of living that everyone should have? And when we universalize, and we can't just think about the US either, we are just a very small fraction of the world. When we universally, if we were to universalize, how we live in the US, or how we think people should live in the US, obviously we've fallen short of that even within our own borders. Many people not living the way, I think most people would say is amenable with human dignity. How's that? But if we universalize that, the strain on the planet, we already have, what's called overshoot day every year. How quickly have we gone through the non-renewable resources of the planet, and that every day it sort of moves up in the calendar every year because we're running through our non-renewable resources very, very fast. And this sort of also gets to the point that you made earlier, future generations, extending our ethical horizon to other species and other generations. If you say this is unsustainable, what does that say about your commitment to future generations? So these are such huge, issues that, and when you look at the state of our political discourse, just to use one example, you see we just are having I don't want to describe the conversation as moronic, but it's pretty darn close. How's that? So how do we get, from here to there? Now I look at it as one way as a journalist, which is, we try to nudge the conversation in a certain direction, but, you presumably look at it from a different framework as a philosopher. How do we shift that conversation? So I'm going to throw that back to you. How do we?
I'll wait for the Q&A and hopefully some of my students will cover me. But let me turn this over to Lisa. She has the next question, but thanks.
Nice punt.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. Yeah, along those lines, I'm curious. Some people argue, certainly, that climate change can't be mitigated without radical attention to social justice issues, and providing resources. In other words, that until we make best practices in climate and the environment affordable to the poor, we can't improve the forecast for humans, much less other, the ecosystems, right? But as the Green New Deal developed, others argued that because it was so vast and tackling so many different issues. Others argued that science and social justice actually sit in some tension with each other with respect to splitting our efforts and, frankly, our money, right? That spreading those efforts and the money around too much and not dealing with the carbon in our atmosphere, it's of such dire importance that should we split our efforts. I'm not arguing for either way, but I'm staying out of that one. But, but I'll kick it to you. What are your thoughts on that debate? Can we, is social justice the key here, or do we need to be really focused for the short term on decreasing our impact?
I think that's a really hard question, and I'm not going to punt, but I think I can make a cogent argument for both positions. I mean, on the one hand, in part precisely because this is a global issue and it's really very difficult geopolitically and ethically, obviously insupportable for those of us, who have run through the world's carbon budget here in the US and Europe, let's say, to then turn around to the developing world and say, well, do as we say, not as we did. Don't electrify. There are hundreds of millions of people in India, for example, who don't have electricity. India has, I think it's shifting somewhat, but it gets most of its electricity from coal. There's just, that's just a fact. And it's very hard for us to say to them, and as I say, they're not going to listen, don't do that, because, it's really bad for the climate. And we already used up, all the space in the atmosphere, unless we provide or help provide an alternative that is acceptable to people. And you can call that, sheer self-interest, or you can call that social justice. How's that? Those are both possibilities. But I think that, it is geopolitically, just infeasible to try to foist, now that we've done so much damage, just try to say, well, you all can't do the same thing we did. So you could argue on a very practical level that social justice is the first step globally toward any kind of mitigation of climate change. Now, that being said, I could also make, I think, a pretty strong argument that the clock is ticking so fast on, carbon emissions. They're so high, they have to come down so fast to stay within, what the scientific community has told us are reasonable boundaries, that you could argue, all of our effort and as you were sort of implying, and all of our resources should go into that. Now, I think that we are a very rich society, even post-COVID, and we should have enough resources to tackle both. And it does seem like we can't get from here to there without a lot of the world on board. How's that? And so it seems to me implies that there's a pretty large social justice component that it would have to be part of any, and I never even use the word solution to climate change, but any amelioration. I think when you think about it, sort of, as I say, both ethically and practically, they both kind of come to that conclusion that social justice is very important.
I just want to follow up on that. There was an interesting article, and I wish I had the reference at the top of my head, but that just came out that said, we thought we couldn't afford to deal with climate change, and then COVID happened. And all of a sudden, we are spending money that we didn't think we had. And so I think that's just kind of an interesting follow-up. But I feel like, in other words, I feel like there are resources for both. It's how we envision the use of that resources and how we prioritize them that's going to be key.
Absolutely. Yeah, we as you say, we declared this an emergency, and it is an emergency. I am no way minimizing COVID, but if you declared a planetary emergency and said, what do we need? And a lot of these economic arguments are kind of I mean, they would be funny if they weren't so hadn't have such tragic implications. Like, what do you think it's going to cost, when you have to move Miami? It's going to cost a lot, So when you're doing a cost benefit analysis, you have to weigh the cost of inaction against the cost of action. That part of the equation often, unfortunately, gets left out.
Thanks. You've strayed ahead a little bit into the question I was going to ask. So I've rewritten a little bit, but to pick up on the theme of COVID, because it seems that as disastrous as COVID has been, it's also been an educational experience for the world, as we've seen what it is we have to do to deal with a global crisis, and also what it is we can manage to live without. And we've seen this in the clearing of the air. What was it? There were articles on the first time Mount Everest has been seen from parts of India and Nepal in years, just simply because the planes aren't in the air, and somehow we're all managing. So I just wanted to ask, in your work and your travels, what if you've seen any other possibilities, or even possibilities connected with COVID, for hope, in the sense that, when you think back, we have a collective action problem. I'm still fascinated, for example, that somehow the United States stopped litter. It was a collective issue, but thanks to a bunch of talking McDonald's wastebaskets and ads with that fellow posing as an Indian with a tear in his eye, we stopped it. Little children yelling at their parents to stop smoking cigarettes and littering. So that worked. But when you think of other really collective efforts, they tend to be national and not as humane as that litter campaign. What comes to mind is you think back through history, Fidel's special time when the Soviet Union fell. He was able to push Cuba together for a little bit, but it was tough. A lot of people died. A lot of people went to jail. Similarly, Mao's Long March and the successive 5-year plans. Again, these were brutal, but designed to serve a collective action. And so I'm just wondering, as you observe and you reflect upon the Sixth Extinction, and you look around the world now at a time of COVID, do you see hope? Do you see the stirrings possibly of the sorts of collective action that could bring about help in managing the current crisis without being so brutal?
Well, I mean, I think that COVID has, I think people will be, studying this for generations. I mean, on the one hand, it's a pretty depressing spectacle. We have manuals on how to handle a pandemic, that are sitting at the CDC, I'm sure, gathering dust. They were, written by the best minds in epidemiology, and we followed it not at all. We just chucked it out the window. We are seeing in Europe, where we might have thought that there was better leadership, ditto, seeing terrible spikes again. So, the basic steps that we basically know how to do, what to do, they wouldn't solve the problem, but they would really ameliorate the problem. We're not taking. And here this sort of gets to your question, in the West, we're failing that test of collective action by, I think, every metric possible. Now, then you could say, well, look, the Chinese actually have had tremendous success, and they didn't, do it gently. How's that? So that is, it raises a lot of really interesting questions about what we value and what we, how do our values line up or not line up? How's that? And I think that, so that does not give me a lot of hope. How's that? Just the fact that we can't take, even when our own lives, individual lives, we all know that, we even if you're a very healthy 22-year-old, you're at risk, have some risk for long-term consequences from COVID. And we're not doing what science tells us we should do, and what rationality, I would argue, tells us we should do. Okay, the more hopeful part, I suppose, is that I think that by putting the brakes on, what was a kind of heedless world that was careening, you know, I mean, I can't look at the world pre-COVID and say, oh, well, we were doing the right thing either. And so by putting the brakes on things, and as you suggested, showing us a lot of different ways of living that are, you know, that we can manage without a lot of things that we would have thought we couldn't, perhaps it has opened up in a longer term way new possibilities of looking at things. And I think, and to the credit of a lot of young people and a lot of your students, I'm sure, people looking for different ways of doing things, saying that the continuation of all of the ways that we thought were sort of sacrosanct and had to this is the way things had to be, that's just not working. So let's rethink things. And I applaud that. I do think we need a lot of pretty serious rethinking.
That dovetails a little bit into or segues into my next question. In 2018, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, put out a special report. They weren't due to give a report. And I found it really interesting. They made it very clear that we are likely unable to remain in a safe carbon zone or temperature zone without some form of geoengineering, some form of extracting carbon from the atmosphere or blocking incoming heat. And I'm fascinated by geoengineering. There are so many different implications of this, but you know, geoengineering is the idea that we should explore sequestering carbon using methods that range from regenerative agriculture on an individual farm to seeding the ocean with iron so that carbon sucking plankton can take that carbon out for us, to even mirrors in space. And yet, even some of the most environmentally conscious people I know are very anti-geoengineering. And I'm just wondering, in the portfolio of solutions you see, where is the role of that kind of work?
Well, I actually just finished a book, the last 2 chapters of which are exactly about this. And I'm gonna separate out, and I think that we need to separate out the two activities which often get lumped together as geoengineering, so that term is kind of hard to grapple with. So there's carbon dioxide removal, you know, ways of taking CO2 out of the air, and then there's ways of which is called carbon dioxide removal, and then there's, you know, what might be called solar geoengineering or solar radiation management. It's sometimes called, where you would not change how much CO2 there is in the air, but you would mask the warming impacts by, for example, you know, blocking incoming radiation or reflecting more sunlight out to space. So I think those are pretty different. One is drawdown of CO2, which, you know, would happen naturally over long timescales. We're just, you know, I don't want to trivialize this in any way. We're trying to speed that up. And the other one is really saying, okay, we have to do something dramatically new and different. It sort of mimics volcanoes. Volcanoes throw up a lot of particles into the air, aerosols that block sunlight and temporarily, you know, cool the planet. We've seen that whenever there's a major eruption, but we would be taking that into our own hands. How's that? Now, so they're both taking, you know, processes that do occur in nature, but, you know, manipulating them very, very heavily. And they both raise really, you know, large problems. How's that? And I think that the report that you alluded to, the special report on 1.5 degrees, that was basically said, you know, not quite flat out, but pretty much flat out, we're not avoiding 1.5 degrees without carbon dioxide removal. We're going to have to draw CO2 out of the air because we just are not going to, in order for us to not hit 1.5 degrees, basically we'd have to, without carbon dioxide removal, we basically have to stop emitting carbon as a globe within the next decade. Now, what are the odds of that? They are not high. Okay, so they sort of fudged in there and put in negative emissions, which, you know, honestly don't exist. We don't know how to do it. There are many possibilities, as you alluded to. There are machines that suck carbon out of the air. I've seen them. I've visited them. You'd need hundreds of millions of them to make a big difference. You need to put the CO2 somewhere. And the problem that you run into is that process takes energy. So we're generating CO2 by generating energy, and then we're going to need more energy to take the CO2 out of the air. So you see the problem there. Okay. But there are also, so-called more natural solutions, but they also have very, very serious implications. Like, in order to really make a difference, planting trees, for example, you need hundreds and hundreds of millions of acres. And where are you getting that? Are you getting it from agricultural land? Are you getting it from the tundra? Are you changing the reflectivity of the earth? I mean, there are huge questions here. Whatever you do at a big enough scale raises big questions. And that's what you get with carbon dioxide removal. Now, when you get into the realm of geoengineering, which I think is going to attract more and more attention as we go forward, then you're into some really interesting territory. We're just basically saying, well, we've screwed with the atmosphere so badly, we have to screw with it in a countervailing way to make keep the planet within these sort of keep the temperatures within these planetary boundaries. I think it's a really fascinating concept. It definitely your immediate reaction is that's insane. But I've talked to, in the process of reporting this book, very, very smart people who will say, well, we have to at least consider this, and we have to at least look at it, because we are not doing the things that we know we need to do right now to bring emissions down, keep the planet within these boundaries. So what are we leaving to another generation if we just say, well, we're not even going to look at that? At some point, someone's going to have to take a look at this. And I think that's also, I'm afraid, a reasonable argument.
So a bit of a shift. I'm going to quote a local here, a former local. I'm always really curious about the motivations, complex sometimes, for inaction about climate change, because we know the story, we know what the problem is. And a former local, Thomas Jefferson, it's a wonderful quote from your book. He did not believe in extinction. And he said, such as the economy of nature, that no instance can be produced of her having permitted any one race of her animals to become extinct, of her having formed any link in her great work so weak as to be broken. And I find this a really fascinating quote here. And I wonder if this sentiment, if you find in your travels that this sentiment persists in some way with people that deny climate change or believe that climate change is real, but that somehow it'll be fixed, either by nature or some higher power? Or is this really more a problem of bad actors? And then after this question, we can go to Q&A.
I think that's, a super good question. And I think that it, and this is not based on very large survey data or whatever. And I don't have the research to go out in the field and ask these questions, but I think they're really interesting questions. And I think it's a combination of the two. I think that there are, unfortunately, a lot of bad actors. There are a lot of, really, really powerful vested economic interests. It's, no secret. I'm not telling people something they don't know, that if you own a fossil fuel company and the future is, and the idea is to, basically make your assets worthless, you're gonna fight that pretty heavily. And on the other hand, I don't think, I think that, so I do think there's been a lot of propaganda, and I do think that the fossil fuel companies realized that all they had to do was sort of introduce doubt. And once again, this has been very well documented in books like The Merchants of Doubt, which I recommend, because people don't really want to change. They didn't really want to give up, all the things that came from this very carbon intensive lifestyle. And I still think that we are in this situation. And I myself, am as guilty as anyone. Every time we travel somewhere, every time we are burning a tremendous amount of carbon, and so we're in the situation now of trying to say, well, let's just do that same thing but without carbon. And to a certain extent, that we know how to do that. We're not doing that, but to a certain extent, we don't know how to do that. Once again, that gets back to we don't know how to fly airplanes without carbon at this point. So the questions of whether we're going to be able, whether it's feasible to even imagine a world in which we just do the same things but we don't generate carbon, whether that's practical or not, I think that's another huge question that is an open question. It's simply an open question, and how much we are willing to say, well, some things are just going to have to go by the boards. Some things are not going to be possible anymore. That also gets to the question of how we run society and whether we make these collective decisions or not. And I don't know the answer. These are going to play out. We don't have the answers yet.
I think now we'll shift to Q&A if Jeremy's got some questions.
Yes, thanks. I'll take over the Q&A from here. So there's already some questions in the queue, so we'll just jump right in. And thank you for that very interesting and sobering conversation. So this first question says, can you imagine that an effective way to provide global accountability to the profound effects humans are having on other species would perhaps be to create a system that monitors the numbers of species at risk or close to extinction within different countries and penalize those countries accordingly? Would such a system of accountability be reasonable, given that not every country has the same economic means to combat the effects of global climate change and habitat loss?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think that it contains within it, the author of that question partly answered it already, that it would be super difficult. And one of the reasons it would be super difficult is because some countries, honestly, like the US, we already deforested most of the US. We already did that, been there, done that. And so would we be penalized for having done that 200 years ago, whereas countries that are in the process of deforesting would be penalized for doing it now? Would that be fair? Also, you have a really difficult problem. Well, you have two really difficult problems as I see it. One, we don't know how many species are out there. We are not monitoring the vast majority of species. I mean, most species on the planet, most of diversity on the planet is insects, okay? We have just not the slightest clue what's going on with insects. So that's a serious problem. And two, another really serious and interesting problem, because I do think there's something really interesting here and important, is that what's called the latitudinal gradient of diversity. I mean, most biodiversity is in the tropics. So we're going to penalize, countries in the tropics where most diversity is, whereas we up in the northern latitudes, where I live, it was glaciated till 10,000 years ago. So every species that in New England has only sort of returned within the last 10,000 years. And we're actually very, sort of biodiversity poor region of the world. So would we get, away with murder, as it were, because we just don't even have that many species? So it raises a really tremendous number of questions. But I think that there's something really interesting in there. Should we have a way, the same way countries are talking about like putting tariffs on other countries' goods if they don't abide by global carbon regime, some kind of carbon limiting regime? Would you just slap a tariff on them and as a punitive measure? Should we have ways of basically trying to police globally what is global resources of biodiversity? And it gets really, really complicated, as I say, because most of the diversity in the world is in the tropics and oftentimes in developing countries, which would be particularly penalized.
Very interesting. So
it is
quite a conundrum. So what would you say to convince the average American voter that combating climate change should be our top priority?
Well, I guess I would say I want you to imagine a world where, your kids, let's say, are living in a world where many of our major global cities are underwater. California is on fire regularly, and that fire zone is growing, and the fire season is growing longer. And imagine what that world is like, and then imagine that we could take steps to try to prevent that. What kind of a call do you make at that point? I think we need to start. I read a tweet today, someone saying we're really voting in the election of 2040. I mean, we are determining what the world is going to look like in 2040, 2050, 2060, and we need to think that way. And if you start thinking that way, your choices look a lot different. And that's the kind of long-term thinking, unfortunately, that climate change demands, because it is a very slow, freight train that doesn't stop for generations. And now, I don't know, would that be a convincing argument to someone who, isn't going to vote, or is going to vote in the way that I might think of as the wrong way? I don't know about that.
Well, certainly important that everyone votes, since we're
Yeah.
So use the opportunity. We have all these people to give a little PSA here.
Exactly.
So next question is, what is the one thing you would want to tell Gen Z about extinction and or the climate crisis?
Well, I think one thing that I want to impart to people, and this gets back to, some of the issues that we were talking about before, is that what we're doing right now, as a species, collectively, individually, and more significantly collectively, these are essentially, for all intents and purposes, irreversible. Obviously, extinction is irreversible, even though there's a lot of talk of de-extinction. That's not happening anytime soon. How's that? And climate change is, for all intents and purposes, unless we get into geoengineering, irreversible. So we are making, just decisions without making them, just doing them sort of without thinking, that will have ramifications. And this is particularly important if you're young, because you're going to live with these ramifications for a long time. So we're making these decisions that will have consequences that will last for as long as anyone who's listening to this, is going to be around.
Great. So the next question is, so when faced with a potential global crisis, environmental crisis back in the 70s, world governments listened to science about the effects of CFCs on the ozone layer and the consequences of its degradation on the environment, and joined together to address and resolve this global problem and potential catastrophe. But why do you think now world governments have not embraced a similar cooperative initiatives to addressing carbon reduction and climate change?
Well, that's another really good question. These are all really good questions. And, I think a lot of climate scientists thought that was exactly what was going to happen. There's this, the Montreal Protocol, which was signed in the late 80s, including by President Ronald Reagan, phasing out CFCs. Okay, so we did that, been there, done that. Let's just do the same thing with carbon. But it turns out that carbon is embedded in so many activities. I mean, CFCs, first of all, we found replacements for them. In some cases, sadly, we are now realizing that those replacements are incredibly powerful greenhouse gases, but we could replace them. And we haven't found easy, and they only had a few manufacturers, so there was not a huge lobbying force against change. And most people didn't feel it in their daily lives. So we had CFCs, now we have some other kind of refrigerant, it just wasn't a big deal to the average person. But if you say to people, well, once again, everyone's going to have to drive an electric car. now many people find that, okay, fine, cool, I'll drive an electric car, but many people are going to say, I don't want to drive an electric car, so at every step of the way, when you try to get rid of fossil fuels from the people, from the industries, the jobs, the way that they're embedded in our lives, every aspect, this Zoom call is, being powered by fossil fuels. It gets really, really hard. And then you have the geopolitics of it. I'm not even getting to the geopolitics. Some entire countries run off of fossil fuel. Saudi Arabia's economy is based on fossil fuel. Russia's economy is based on selling fossil fuels. So it gets to be very, very difficult to craft that kind of international agreement.
So this next question is a two-part question. The first part's very easy. It's just, is that an Auk painting behind you?
Yes, it's a great Auk.
And the second question, the more substantial question, I guess, you mentioned the idea towards the end of your book that humans have never truly aligned with nature. So given this idea, even if we can control carbon emissions and other factors, how can our relationship with animals change to become aligned with nature, considering we have never been able to do so successfully?
I don't have a good answer for that. And I would never say, honestly, that, we're going to become aligned with nature. And it would be, a pretty tall order to say that at the moment when there are, almost 8 billion people on the planet, suddenly we're going to align with nature when there were, a couple million people on the planet, we were already responsible for, pretty major extinction event. But that being said, we, are entering into a time, and we have a tremendous intellectual resources and scientific resources and technological resources that our ancestors did not have. So we need to, and this is a very fuzzy answer, trying to think in new ways. But I don't think that we are going to, align with nature. I think the best we are going to do is make a conscious decision that there are things, once again, either for selfish reasons or for ethical reasons, ethics towards other species, that we want to preserve. That doesn't necessarily mean that we're, living in a state of nature. It means that we are making a pretty conscious decision that we don't want to destroy everything. So I guess that's the best I can do. And there's a big, movement, once again, in the world, can we put aside 30% of the land surface on Earth, for example, just for other species to be? That also gets into very complicated questions of whose land is it, et cetera. But that's one way you might think about it. Could we put aside, a third of the planet for other species, try to get them, as many species as possible, sort of through this period of maximum human population and maximum, what we hope will be maximum human impacts over the next, say, 75 years. And I think that requires a tremendous amount of consciousness, but it doesn't require us, necessarily to be in a state of nature.
Great. So this next question alludes a little bit to your comments on China's approach to the COVID crisis, but applicable to the climate crisis. The question asks, can the world control climate change and maintain a commitment to liberal democracy?
That is a great question. Unfortunately, these are the big imponderables and the big unanswerables. Could it, in theory? I think that all of us could agree that we could come up with a theoretical plan for how that could be, and we would potentially just align, market forces. I mean, climate change has been called the greatest market failure in the history of man. And if we aligned market forces with trying to solve the climate crisis, it may be entirely possible to control climate change, to ameliorate, basically bring our emissions way, way down without any of the kind of, intrusive, what we would call intrusive government, and what we here in the US would call that. But it's also possible that we won't do that or can't do that for precisely the same reasons, because we are such a pluralistic and divided country and world. And then we will find out, what the impacts are. Does that lead us down the road to, more totalitarianism? And I remember, a book I read 15 years ago or something where someone was proposing basically one day there's going to be, carbon police, and you're going to, they're going to come around and see whether you're, what your carbon output is. And that's what we're inevitably headed towards, because we're not going to control ourselves between now and then. So, that sounds like dystopian fiction, but could it happen? Anything seems possible to me right now.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, on the note of partisanship, there was a comment in the queue, and maybe I'll try to reframe it more as a question. But so, we're in this time of hyperpartisanship in the United States. What do you think it would take for us to kind of overcome that, for us to have some sort of common recognition that there's this problem and we need collective action?
I mean, that seems to me to be like such a key question. And until we can sort of solve that, as it were, and there are a lot of people, a lot of social scientists, a lot of politicians working on that, I think we're in a bad way. I mean, I think a lot of things are going to become clear on Tuesday or Wednesday or Thursday. Let us pray. But I think that one thing, hopeful thing that people often point to is that social movements, nothing happens, and then suddenly people's attitudes change, and I think that is obviously the best that we can hope for. That there's mounting. I mean, when you look at the polling data, for example, you see, that climate change is a much more salient issue to younger voters, and that's true. It's not as true if you're in one party or another, but it's still true that it's rising up the ladder of, so it's possible that there will be a generational shift. If we look at issues like gay marriage, it seemed impossible that we were going to get sort of bipartisan support, and then suddenly there was. So I think a lot of it depends on that shift also in the political class, and what they see they need to do to win. So I don't have the key to that, but I think it's possible. It's just possible that it's going to happen sooner than we think.
Well, I hope so. And
well, and I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but I do think attitudes are changing pretty fast.
Well, that's good. That's very hopeful. It contrasts a bit to this next question, which is rather on the hopeless side, and maybe, well, we'll see what you think, but I'm not going to play the censor here. This says, what are your thoughts on an emerging school of thought within the environmental community, apparently called collapse, that human extinction is simply unavoidable, and we just need to grieve, try to consume and produce less, and emphasize trying learning how to get along with each other in the time we have left?
Well, even though I wrote a book called The Sixth Extinction, and I very often get asked about human extinction, I think human extinction is the least of our worries. I mean, human suffering is a very big worry, I believe, but I don't believe that humans are going extinct anytime soon. I mean, we are if you looked at like the mass extinctions of the past, species that tend to come through mass extinctions, they're very numerous and they're very widespread. And that's what we are. We are a global species. So I think the idea of just complete collapse, I guess that's not what my worry is. My worry is that there's going to be hard times, and many people are going to suffer quite possibly. And many people, many people will suffer. And even it's possible that there'll be a lot of casualties, it's possible that there'll be wars. But I think the only way we could really knock ourselves completely out of this planet is, a nice big nuclear conflagration, which, we're certainly not incapable of. But I don't think that we have gotten to the point where we need to just embrace collapse as the only option. I think we're actually incredibly resourceful. And between now and collapse, there are many, many, many possibilities, some of which are will hasten our demise, and some of which will not. Now, in the grand scheme of things, I also do want to say, yeah, humans will go extinct. Every species that has ever evolved has gone extinct. So but we're still a pretty young species, and we're a pretty clever species. And the other point that I want to make, which I suppose is slightly contradictory, is we are doing in all the other great apes. We are a great ape. We're doing in the orangutans. We're doing in chimps. We're doing in gorillas, our closest relatives. So at the point where humans shuffle off this mortal coil for whatever reason, the question of whether there will be anything to follow us from our own family of great apes is a really interesting question. It's a very kind of sad, tragic footnote to this all.
Yeah, so we're gonna I have one more question from the audience, and then we're gonna kick it back to Professor Greer, who's gonna close out with one final question. So the last question from the audience is, are there any species that are especially vulnerable and or important to protect in the sense that they are the linchpins for their particular ecological communities? So which species must be protected to fend off global ecological calamity?
Well, I mean, that is another really, really good question that I can't answer in the abstract. I mean, many people are interested in that question, like what are the keystone species? What are the species that keep ecosystems intact? There are definitely a lot of species that are sort of ecosystem engineers. There are all the species that are at the bottom of the food chain. You would think that they would be extremely important to preserve if you want to keep ecosystems intact. You look at, Lisa and I were talking about coral reefs. If you want to protect coral reef systems, you have to protect the builders of those systems. You have to protect the corals. But that being said, it's often, I think, not that easy, and I'm not an expert on this at all. It's often not that easy to identify what the keystone species are or how to protect them. So, but this is really urgent work, absolutely urgent work. And our efforts, a lot of our conservation efforts, a lot of really laudable conservation efforts. I don't in any way want to disparage them, but they are not based on they're based on how cuddly the animal is or how charismatic the animal is, and the really, really crucial sort of animals or plants that sustain ecosystems get overlooked sometimes. So that's an important point to make.
Great, thank you. I'll send it back to Professor Greer, who's going to close out the questions.
Thank you. So this is, I suppose, the question I most wanted to ask. There's an increasing sense of doom, of despair, of inevitability that I see in our students and in other younger people. And I really struggle to provide hope. So my job is to provide accurate information for our students, but also to empower them to do good work. And I want them to believe that it's not too late. But when I recently asked my class just a few days ago what they thought they might be able to do to provide a better, more sustainable life in the future, one of my students said, "But I'm not a scientist. I feel like all I can do is care and talk about this." So I would like to end with asking you what advice you might have for this student or for those of us that are teaching in a small liberal arts or elsewhere who need to teach and share the truth, but also remain hopeful for change and progress.
Well, one thing I want to say is something that I once heard that really, I think that all I can do is talk about it. Your student is not giving him or herself enough credit, because talking about it is really important. And many people have, many social scientists have documented how not talking about things is a real barrier to action. People think, it's either embarrassing to talk about, or it seems like you're just, bringing a dead fish into the room when you talk about climate change, or it's just not important. I mean, I remember several years ago, someone told me they'd run focus groups. This was from an environmental group. And one point that people made is, well, if climate change were a really important issue, people would be talking about it, So there's a lot of reasons why not talking about an issue, and I think climate change has not been talked about enough. And one of the hopeful things I do see, and as I say, I am not, like a super optimistic person, is that it is finally being talked about. And that is the first step to any kind of action in a society like ours. And so I think that being out there and talking is crucial. And that is perhaps, I don't want to say it's the best thing that we can be doing right now. The best thing that we could be doing right now is, changing our energy systems, but we could be making noise is actually important, and everyone can do that. So I think, and the other thing that I will end by saying is, it seems like a really dark time right now. It may be a very dark time right now. None of us does have a crystal ball. Climate scientists have a pretty good idea of what the temperature is going to do, but they don't have a very good idea even of how the biosphere is going to react to a lot of this. And there have been very dark times in human history before, the plague, my own, grandparents were, refugees from Nazi Germany. I mean, people have lived in very, very dark times, and they have found the strength and courage and resilience to go on. And I absolutely feel that humanity will go on. I don't necessarily think that a lot of other species will survive into that future, but I do think that there is a possibility of a brighter future, and everyone has to work towards that.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This has been really valuable, and I know your time is very valuable. I can't wait to talk to my students about this afterwards. So I also want to thank the Roger Mudd Center for Ethics and Brian Murchison, its dynamic director, for making this event available to us. I want to thank Amy Jarrett and Patrick Sheridan for organizing, facilitating, and running this smoothly. That's pretty impressive to me. Jeremy Weissman, thank you so much for sorting through many thoughtful questions and sharing them with us. And of course, to Mark Rush, my excellent co-panelist, with questions that I can't even begin to think about how to answer. But I really want to thank the audience for taking the time to think about this, to learn about it. We had a lot of people show up, and that gives me some hope too. So thank you so much, Elizabeth, and I hope we meet again.
Oh, well, thank you all. It was really a great conversation. I'm sorry I didn't get to hear your answer to that question, Mark. I'm gonna have to call you back on that one, yeah.
Okay, one point or another. Thanks so much.
Okay.
This has been great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.